All right, hello everybody. This is supposed to be the Nathan and Andrew podcast, but I was busy moving stuff last week, so I wasn't able to get you guys an episode. And Nathan's moving this week, um, so I decided to give this a shot solo, so you guys wouldn't have to be sitting there waiting for stuff. And I recently just finished a book, which was not reading, so he probably couldn't comment on it too well. So I figured we might as well kind of go over that book and maybe do some reflection on it, see how it ties into stuff. And I'm gonna maybe do a couple questions about some libertarian ideas that you can maybe pull out of this. Um, this book is called Kings of People: Power and Mandate to Rule by Reinhard Bendix. It's kind of a part of a series of books I'm reading or going to be trying to read, um, kind of based on political power and the kind of conventional way of seeing it. The other series of books that I'll be reading on this is based on the aristocracy. Let's see what we got here. We got State and Status, Monarchy, Aristocracy, and the State of Europe, 1300 to 1800, Nobilities in Transition, 1550 to 1700, and the Persistence of the Old Regime. So those are the next series of books I'll be reading. I'll bring you something on those when I finish them, but that's not what we read. We read Kings of People. So to give you a small overview of the book, it goes through um, the ancient and medieval regimes and how the mandate originally came from heaven um, for the kings to rule, and how as the state system started being implemented in the 1600s, how that shifted to people, and they followed a couple different countries. So they followed how that transformation happened in Japan, Russia, Germany, England, and then France as well. Though France is primarily just in the second half of the book. And then what else we got? And then they lightly touch on the Chinese and Arabs as well, but they are much smaller parts of the book. So it was very interesting. Um, if you're I'm trying to think of who I would recommend to read this book, because most people are probably not going to find this very interesting. Um, but if you are into kind of seeing how dynamics have changed over time and how rules have changed, how rulers have had to change how they mandate power and stuff, it's interesting. And there's a couple things that it kind of reflects on. So we're kind of going through a thing right now where um, the United States, or not, well, yeah, the United States is kind of fallen down, and this idea of the mandate of people, I think, is going to start being questioned in the coming decades. Let's say it'll probably be a while, but I don't think this mandate from heaven or mandate from people is going to last, because it's lacking the mandate from heaven. And that's the thing that I think when people think about how people ruled back in the day. Obviously, there was certain amounts of authoritarianism and central control, and that's another thing that the book covers very well, is how those different societies were controlled and how they transformed and shifted when this kind of transition inevitably happened. So. In Russia, everything was very centrally located, or not centrally located, but very centrally controlled, even more extreme than your French king that you think of with the Sun King, Louis XIV kind of thing. So it's much more centrally controlled than that. And uh, because of this, and because of the rural nature of the whole thing, and the way the feudalism worked, it was very hard for them to transition. Whereas places like England and France, even though France had the disastrous French Revolution, um, were able to transition a little bit easier because they had some of these other civic societies, open debate, freedom of speech type institutions, cultural beliefs that didn't exist in some of these other more authoritarian places. So it made the transition really much harder. in Russia, and then Japan's a very unique case because um, instead of coming from the peasantry, uh, I guess it didn't ever. Well, in the French case, it came from the peasantry, and was kind of instigated by the upper echelons of people. Hmm, I'm probably not describing this very well. The big thing with the Japanese transition is that while it was like a revolution, it was kind of what we're experiencing right now in the United States, right? So it kind of came. It was like a top-down revolution approach. There was no like massive fighting and bloodbath in the streets. It was just kind of like, well, to survive, we need to switch this ruler for this ruler. So it's kind of like this political transformation that's happening with Donald Trump right now, right? So as people might be able to observe, we're going through a nationalist trend, and things are shifting um, right now, and we're changing from being um, not isolationist, but we're going from a nationalist identity or like a globalist identity to a nationalist identity, and like that whole draining the swamp and getting kind of the new generation in. It's going to take a little bit, and hopefully that continues to proceed. It seems like it will. How bloody and all that stuff it's going to be remains to be seen. But if it can be done from a top-down approach, this is kind of how it would play out. Where like you have Donald Trump getting in there, and he kind of changes, he creates an entire paradigm shift where it's like this is how we're going to do things from now on, and the old guard of like the Nancy Pelosi's, the Chuck Schumers, the Mitch McConnells, and stuff like that, they're replaced with much people who much more aligned to like a nationalist type structure, and then that's kind of like we had a complete 180 in how the entire system works, but there was no like you didn't have to write a whole new constitution and stuff like that. And Japan did write a new constitution in the end and stuff, but the change was it was radical, but not violent, or not nearly as violent as like your French revolutions, your Revolutionary War, 1776, um, Bolshevik Revolution. Like you think of most of the revolutions, and it just there's a reason it's called the Meiji Restoration and not revolution, right? It was a very different thing. Now that probably has much more to do with the fact that it's a Japanese cultural thing than anything else, and just they had certain advantages of being able to um, be so isolated in their island. It kept them safe and allowed them to kind of go through this transition and really identify who they were as a people over a very long period of time that most cultures don't get. It's it's very unique. It's very interesting. It doesn't explain why Japan is the way it is nowadays necessarily, but it gives some context as to why they are the way they are. And I don't understand it because I'm not Japanese. I'm American. But some of the stuff that they come up with, absolutely love it. Um, so that's I don't know if it's a good synopsis of the book, but that is a synopsis of the book. Um, so yeah, and one of the reasons that it kind of spurred me on this will kind of transition us into the other topic here is if I can find my Word document. Um, is understanding like how these other government types work and stuff like that, so you can kind of discuss and think about these things um, in the correct framework. So one thing that's always kind of bugged me is libertarianism and stuff like that. Like ever since I was technically like a libertarian for like 3 months or something like that, um, and it never struck me as sound. Like I couldn't find arguments that beat it, so I kind of like conceded for a little bit, and I was like, all right, well, I haven't found anything that everything you've presented so far, I don't have a way to refute. To be honest, or like if I want to be honest, that means I have to kind of go along with it for the time being. But if I find something that'll refute it, then I can beat it. So, um, one of the things that, and this isn't, not all libertarians obviously believe in the anarcho-capitalist society or whatever, but one thing that always kind of strikes me about how they describe it is they are effectively describing corporate feudalism, which, like, if they want a feudal society, that's fine, but it's framed like it's a novel new thing, I guess, and that always kind of bugs me. Like it's obviously not like a new thing. Um, so you have this idea that you're gonna have this society, and everything's gonna be private property, and then everyone that you don't want on your property you can kick out at any time. And it's like, okay, but that's like exactly how feudalism works, right? So like basically the way it worked is kings and stuff would have property and they would protect those people on that property, right? A king, or like let's just say a lord, right? A lord would have this property and he's like, I got to protect this property. And he would get some knights and various people would come to it. Like okay, let's just break it down to the way libertarians want it, right? So everyone has their individual. Everyone's a quarter acre tyrant, as I like to call it. Everyone's got their little quarter acre. They're their own king on their quarter acre. All right, everything's great. Um, but turns out probably not everybody wants to follow the non-aggression principle. Let's just assume that humans are humans and not everybody wants to follow that. Okay, so what's the outflow of that then? So from that, we're going to have some people that either don't want to defend themselves just because they're um, just think of kind of like liberal type people where they're like, oh, um, I'm not trying to bag on them necessarily, but it's like I don't want to like I want someone else to take that responsibility. Just think of or like a delegation, right? So like I can't do my electricity, so I hire someone to do my electricity. I can't defend myself, so I hire someone to do my defense. And I know various people are going to say uh, that believe in defending themselves and all that stuff, like that they're against that, but there's always going to be a certain percentage of the population that wants to outsource that responsibility, and that's fine. We live in like that's how societies work. Um, so you're going to get someone to delegate, be like, hey, can you protect me? And we're all in an agrarian. So like in the feudal ages and stuff like it's basically completely agrarian society. So it's like, okay, well, what I'm going to protect you. I'm totally willing to say that I will protect you. But it's like, what are you going to pay me with? Like, you can't just give me some. Well, you could give me some of your land, right? Um, but like, what's the better way to do it? It's like, okay, well, how about this? I get a percentage of your like payment off your land or whatever, and you can farm it for the rest of whatever, and that will make it so that the time I have to take to protect you is then uh, covered. Like I can still feed myself and be able to fulfill that duty. And so then, it pyramids up, right? So you have these individuals that pledge themselves to like their neighbors in their community, and then that community um, might be beset by a larger force or something like that because some other people made a larger coalition, so then they have a coalition with another group, and then it pyramids up, and eventually you get to the point where you have lords and dukes and counts and duchies and kings, and voila, you have feudalism. So it's like if that's how you want to play things, and you have you just put a corporate structure over that, like you have a worse, in my opinion, you have a worse system of feudalism because those corporations aren't accountable to anybody, right? Like the nice part about medieval feudalism was the idea that um, the people were accountable to um, to God, right? It's uh, the king, like we have this um, conviction of the uh, Catholic. It's everyone's like Catholic in this area, and so your duty is to protect and be just and stuff like that. And this whole society is built on that foundational ideal of like the Christian values and the Christian philosophy. So in the Christian philosophy, a lot of their philosophical roots go back to the Greeks, and then the standard for law is via the Romans, and voila, you have the three pillars of uh, Western civilization, which is the Christian tradition, Christian cultural tradition, the Greek philosophy, and the Roman judicial system. So, like, wait, would you rather have a corporation like dictating this stuff? Like, they can be arbitrary. They'd be like, oh, I just didn't make enough money or what, and it's like you're axed and you're gone. And then if you're set up in a system where, like in feudalism, like you were tied to the land, right? So like um, in their system where it's all corporate, right? It's like, oh, you're not producing enough, so now I get to axe you and kick you out, and you just got to go find your own thing. In feudalism, like I'm sure there was like if you weren't kind of if you were being lazy and you weren't kind of pulling your weight kind of thing, I'm sure there was a way to make you accountable. Because things swing both ways, obviously. With this stuff, too lenient on one side, people are going to exploit it. You're too extreme on the other side, people are going to exploit it. There's always like a happy medium. That is the one thing that fence sitters to certain extent have correct. There is like a medium to most things. Um, but it like a corporate thing, like okay, so feudalism, you're tied to the land, right? So that sounds bad, but the thing is, you can't be kicked off your land in a sense. This is one of the issues that they had in England with the enclosure system. Is uh, peasants were basically subsistence farmers. They made basically enough extra to be able to pay their taxes and then be able to subsist off the remainder. And then they had these things with the commons. And if you guys are familiar with the tragedy of the commons um, idiom, is the idea that there's this common area, and if people were selfish, they would the thing that benefited the individual the most was to put as many of the cows in the common area to be able to use that resource as much as possible. And if everybody did that to the max extreme, the entire commons area would end up being destroyed. If you live and are basically a subsistence farmer and you have pretty good relations with all your community, this isn't a problem. This tragedy of the commons thing doesn't happen, right? It's only like a greed, like corporatist, capitalist type mindset of like trying to greed out every little penny that you like get this, because it's a false scarcity type mindset. Basically, um, most people that are growing stuff, and I don't grow a ton of stuff. I only had like a small garden this year. Hopefully, I can expand it next year. But a lot of people that do this like garden stuff, uh, the urban gardener guy, what's his name? Anyway, he's got a great one where it's like there is no scarcity, right? So if you don't believe there's scarcity, it's not that big of a deal to only put your guy on the pasture, your cow on the pasture for a short amount of time, the amount that you need, and because of your religious convictions and stuff like that, you know not to take more than is your due, so that keeps things in check, and then the commons works out nicely. So with the enclosures, what happened is, I think I got way off sidetracked, but we'll finish this thought. With the enclosures, what happened is they came in and they took all of this common area and basically fenced it off for the nobility, and only nobility could use it. And then that's when like corporate or commercial sheep farming was taking off for the cloth industry to bolster English cloth trade and cloth manufacture, because textiles is the major industry that always takes off in an industrialized country. It always starts with textiles. So um, that kind of like ruined the whole commons thing. um, I totally forgot what my point was. This is why it's useful to have a second person around. Let's see if anyone's in the chat. Nope. Okay. Uh, so they enclose all this area, and now the farmers, uh, subsistence farming doesn't really work anymore, and people have to start moving to the factories and stuff like that. So, okay. So the corporate way it would work is like you destroy that commons area almost immediately, or it wouldn't even exist. And then, like, the instant you're not making money, you're chopped, and it's like, okay, well, I needed this land to live and produce and be able to feed my family, and now it's like not there. And it's like, what are you supposed to do? Like, it's basically Irish potato famine kind of situation, except like Irish potato famine was because of like crop failure, not just because, uh, you know, you're not like you're only producing 100 hectares and we want 120 hectares. So it's not like you could, in theory, get chopped just because you're not producing enough. Like there was a one story, I think EA kind of off topic, but EA had like a games company that was making them like $2 million in revenue a year, right? And they axed that section of the company because it's like, well, unless you're making, because the company was so big that it was like, well, unless you're making us 4 billion a year, or not 4 billion, 4 million a year, it's just not worth it. Like, it's like, because of all the infrastructure and all the other things that go along with it, like it just wasn't worth it, kind of thing. But 2 million for like a side, like if they were independent, would be great. Same kind of thing works here. If if you had corporate feudalism, like everything, like you could have people getting kicked off the land and stuff like that, where it's just like not producing. It's kind of like what's going on with what's probably going to happen with rents right now. Um, Once this the rent forbearance thing ends and the mortgage forbearance ends, everyone's going to be expected to pay. No one's going to have the money to pay, and then no one's going to be able to go in there and fill those spots because it's like, okay, you kicked them out, but like there's no one to fill the spot. Like, what's the point? And it's like some money is better than no money kind of thing. Uh, I don't know, and I don't know how that's going to play out, but it's kind of that mentality. What would end up happening? I think there's obviously no example for me to really pull from for how that would work, but it's just kind of it's something to kind of think of where the things that they're touting have technically existed already, but they never seem to reference the idea of a feudalistic society, and I find that interesting. Um, and I know like plenty of these people are. To be fair, I haven't read like all of Murray Rothbard and or Hans Hermann. I do want to read some Hermann Hoppe because the Democracy the God That Failed. He might be one of the people that would know like this corporate feudalism type thing. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It's just kind of an interesting thought. So, um, I feel like I should get back to the book again because I don't think I talked about it much. Um, how do I want to describe it? So it's kind of lengthy. It's 600 pages. Um, but okay, here's something I do want to discuss about it. So, um, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think I want to elaborate on it more. So you have this dichotomy where you have this separation between like a mandate of people and a mandate of from God, right? And it's I did write something on this. Hold up. And so you have this disconnect, and do do do. Oh no, that's different. So you have this disconnect where it is um, where it's both people and it's like basically it's like God or people. And in my opinion, it's kind of both, right? It's not an or. Uh, and I'm not trying to say like men are gods, just or a god kind of thing. Like that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is the way it's kind of framed is that you can't have and the way a lot of these things are framed, especially like if you think about communism and stuff like that, like uh, uh, the classic um, Bane quote from the movies, where it's like, "I give it to you, the paper," and that's probably a terrible interpretation of him, but um, it's the idea that the people can take whatever they want if they want it, kind of thing, and in that interpretation of it, there's no limits on the people, which there obviously has to be. And those limits are set out by God through the Bible, or I guess if you're like an Arab, I'd be through the Quran, and if you are um, Chinese or Japanese, it'd probably be Confucian teachings, right? There's always some higher religious uh, aspect that is the curtailment for the people. And so I think the way it works, and this isn't how the book lays it out, but it's something that I thought about with the book, is it's people are um, it's the people can enforce their will on the government as long as that will is aligned with God's will, which then doesn't really make it their will, but well, everybody has free will. Yeah, kind of figuring this out in real time here. Um, so yeah, so it's people have the power to enforce their demands on the government. Like there's obviously more of them. It's harder to coordinate those people, so that's their downfall. But if they follow God, they it's it can create a good society. Like and that just kind of goes back to the whole idea that like morals dictates everything. Basically, is kind of what I'm getting at. And your society always defaults to your lowest common denominator, right? So uh, to a certain point, right? So if you have uh, like I'm not sure how this would work. So like okay, let's take this theory. So if you had like 99% good people, right? And then you had like one degenerate. And the 99% good people just kind of like made demands that kind of forced the degenerate up to their level. Like is that possible or does it always default to the lowest common denominator of the degenerate? I mean, there is that. Owen has always says the majority is one moral man, which I do believe is correct. But it's like, okay, well, how does that fit in this framework that I'm trying to set up here? I mean, if you had 99 actually moral people, which like at that point you're basically saying you have 99 Jesuses and one devil, and it's like, well, the 99 Jesuses are going to kick out the devil. Like that seems kind of obvious. It's like, but we're obviously not we can never like Jesus is something to aspire to be, but because we know we're fallen and we're human, we can't actually ever be Jesus. But there's amazing levels we can reach if you just look at the saints, right? So, that's an attainable level that even for me seems almost unattainable. So, if we go based on that, uh, you're the way it would kind of sort out. Sure, it might be the lowest common denominator, but it would be something else. All right, I think that's all I got on there. A couple side musings here on this as well is I just listened to was it like some heroes thing on Netflix, which I know I shouldn't have because Cutie is disgusting. Um, but it was actually good. And it kind of like goes through like the story arcs of like villains and stuff like that, and myths and how myth stories are built and stuff. And it pulled from like it used as like references a lot of myths that we know, um, whether it be more modern myths of Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, or your classic myths of the Odyssey and um, King Arthur. And then, but like the overall story that they told was one that I hadn't heard of before, which was like a Slavic tale. And so it kind of blended like some stuff you probably haven't heard of with some stuff you're very familiar with, and kind of connecting those two. I thought it was really well done. I haven't watched all of it, but I do recommend it. One thing I kind of noticed when I was going through there that was interesting, and just kind of like a side note at the very end here, is the sirens and how much that imagery like relates to uh, like a porn addiction, right? It's like it's the call to, and they're usually portrayed as like attractive young females, right? And it's like this siren's call that like sucks you in and ends up being your doom, and like people just they sit there and they wither because um, they're stuck, and uh, they just they're they're stuck with these sirens that don't bear any fruit, kind of thing, and they wither and die and they don't go anywhere. And it's just like it's the same thing of like, you know, you're getting this fix that think makes you think that you're um, you're being a man, and you know you're getting all these women and stuff like that, and it's like that's the part of the brain that you're tricking, but in reality, like, you're not bearing fruit, you're not having kids, you're not building families and stuff like that. And I thought it was interesting how that those two played out. So uh, be aware of your sirens. That's all I gotta say. um, that goes for me as well. Don't always don't always listen to my own advice sometimes, and follow the siren's call. um all right, I think that is the last little bit from me. Um, yeah. So I don't know if I'm gonna try to make this more regular, where maybe me and Nate do a like I do one try to do one daily. And I can talk about like more of these kind of side topics and what I'm reading and all that fun stuff. And then me and Nate do like what's happening in the world kind of thing, and maybe I try to connect some of those things back. Um, but yeah, I think this is a good shot, and we'll see how that goes. But anyway, thanks everybody who tuned in. Like, subscribe, and share if you thought it was interesting. And I'll leave a link to the book on Amazon if people are interested. Um, so yeah, thank you everybody, and have a good weekend.